I always enjoyed camping alone. There was something about being out in the woods, away from people, away from the noise of everyday life, that made me feel at peace. I wasn't the kind of person who needed company to enjoy myself. I liked the quiet, the way the forest moved and breathed around me. I'd done it dozens of times before, setting off with my pack and rifle, heading deep into the trees where no one else went. This time was no different. It was early October, just cool enough to be comfortable but not cold enough to need heavy gear. I had planned a week-long trip in a national forest in northern Montana, near the Canadian border. The area was remote. No cell service, no ranger stations nearby, just miles and miles of untouched wilderness. That's how I liked it. I had checked the weather before heading out, made sure my pack was fully stocked, and set off in my truck early in the morning, driving nearly 3 hours from the nearest town before turning onto an unmarked dirt road. The road was rough, barely more than 2 tire tracks cutting through the trees, but my truck handled it fine. I drove for another 20 minutes before stopping at a small clearing beside a creek. From there, I would hike. I parked, got my gear together, and locked up the truck. I had my rifle slung over my shoulder, my pack strapped tight against my back. The weight was familiar, comforting. I knew everything I needed was inside: food, water, a tent, extra clothes, first aid kit, my hunting knife. I double-checked it all before stepping onto the trail, then started walking. The first few hours passed easily. The forest was dense, mostly pine and spruce, with the occasional clearing where sunlight broke through the canopy. The air smelled clean, fresh, the way only the deep woods do. Birds called from the branches, and somewhere in the distance, I heard the sound of a woodpecker hammering against a tree. I walked until late afternoon, then found a good spot to set up camp. A small, flat stretch of ground near a stream, surrounded by thick trees. It was well hidden, out of sight from any trails or game paths. I cleared a space for my tent, set up my small fire ring, and gathered enough wood to last the night. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, I cooked a simple meal over the fire, just some canned beans and jerky. The night was quiet, peaceful. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the rustling of the trees in the wind. I sat there for a long time, staring into the flames, letting my mind wander. When I finally crawled into my tent and zipped up my sleeping bag, I fell asleep almost instantly. I woke up sometime in the night. At first, I wasn't sure why. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow against the fabric of my tent. Everything was still, silent, the kind of silence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I listened. Nothing. No wind. No insects. No movement in the trees. Then I heard it. A single, sharp snap. Somewhere close. Too close. It wasn't the sound of a branch breaking under its own weight. It was something stepping on it. I stayed perfectly still, barely breathing. My rifle was outside, leaning against a tree next to the fire. My knife was under my sleeping bag. I slowly reached for it, gripping the handle tight. The sound didn't come again. For what felt like an eternity, I lay there, ears straining, waiting for another noise. But the forest remained silent. Finally, after what must have been an hour, I let my grip loosen and forced myself to relax. Could have been anything: a deer, a bear, even a raccoon. Animals passed through campsites all the time. Still, I didn't sleep much after that. Morning came slow. The sky was overcast, gray clouds blocking out the sun. I got up, stretched, and checked around camp. Nothing looked disturbed. I made coffee over the fire, ate a quick breakfast, and decided to go for a hike. I spent most of the day moving through the forest, taking my rifle with me in case I spotted anything worth hunting. But I never fired a shot. The woods were oddly empty. I didn't see any deer, no fresh tracks, nothing. Even the birds were quieter than usual. That feeling of being watched stuck with me all day. By the time I made it back to camp, I was exhausted. I had covered nearly 10 miles, circling back along a ridgeline that overlooked the valley. The sun was already setting, painting the sky in deep reds and purples. I gathered more firewood, made dinner, and tried to shake the uneasy feeling gnawing at my gut. The night passed the same way. Silence, stillness, then the sound of something moving in the trees. I didn't sleep. By the third day, I was ready to leave. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was letting my imagination get the best of me, but my instincts were screaming at me to get out. I packed up camp, made sure the fire was out, and started hiking back to my truck. I moved fast, covering the ground in half the time it had taken me to get in. The whole time, I felt like something was behind me, just out of sight. Then, about a mile from my truck, I saw them. Footprints. Not mine. Fresh. Deep. Someone had been following me. I gripped my rifle tighter and kept moving. When I reached the clearing where I had left my truck, my stomach dropped. The truck was still there, but the driver's side door was open. I knew I had locked it. I stepped closer, heart hammering in my chest. The inside was a mess. My glove compartment open, papers scattered. My spare water bottles were missing, and so was my emergency kit. But the keys were still in the center console. Whoever had been here hadn't wanted the truck. They had wanted me to come back to it. I didn't hesitate. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. Gravel kicked up as I spun the tires, tearing out of the clearing faster than I ever had in my life. I didn't stop. Not until I hit pavement, not until I saw houses and power lines and other people. I never went back to that forest. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted, and I don't ever want to find out. There's something about the deep woods that makes people disappear. Some folks think it's wild animals. Some think it's just people getting lost. But I know better. Sometimes something else is out there, watching, waiting. I hadn't been camping since she passed. My wife used to be the one who packed everything. She made sure we had the right gear, the right food, the right maps. I just carried the heavy stuff and set up the fire. But now it was just me, standing in my garage, looking at our old camping equipment like it belonged to someone else. The tent was still rolled up in its bag, dusty from years of disuse. The sleeping bags smelled faintly of her shampoo. It had been 2 years. 2 years of an empty house. 2 years of coming home to silence. I thought camping again might help, at least for a weekend. It was something we used to love, something that made us feel alive. Maybe it would help me feel something again. I picked a place far from town, somewhere quiet. I didn't want to run into families or couples out hiking. I just wanted to be alone. The spot I chose was about a 5-hour drive from home, deep in the woods near an old, abandoned logging site. There was a lake nearby and a long, winding trail that stretched for miles in either direction. The perfect place to disappear for a while. The drive was long but familiar. Winding roads, tall trees, the occasional glimpse of a river through the gaps in the forest. It reminded me of all the times we'd done this together, stopping for gas, picking up snacks, arguing about which road to take. But now it was just me and the radio playing songs I didn't really hear. I arrived late in the afternoon. The sky was overcast, thick with gray clouds that promised rain but never delivered. The air smelled like damp earth, rich and clean. I found a clearing off the main dirt road, far enough into the woods that I wouldn't be disturbed, but not so far that I couldn't find my way back. Setting up camp was harder than I remembered. The tent didn't seem to want to go upright. The firewood I gathered was damp. The wind kept shifting, making it hard to get the flames going. By the time I had everything settled, the sun was already dipping below the trees, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I ate a simple meal, canned beans, some bread, a bottle of water. It wasn't the same without her. She used to cook over the fire, making things that actually tasted good. I just ate for the sake of eating. The first night was uneventful. Just the sounds of the forest, crickets, the rustling of leaves, the occasional crack of a branch in the distance. Normal things, but I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard something moving outside the tent. Probably just animals, but it kept me on edge. The second day, I decided to hike. The trail stretched deep into the woods, winding through old trees with thick trunks covered in moss. The air was cool, the kind of crispness that settled deep in your lungs. I walked for hours, letting my thoughts drift, trying to enjoy the quiet. But there was this feeling I couldn't shake, like I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing in the trees. But there was nothing, just the woods, stretching endlessly in every direction. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to my nerves, to being alone out here for the first time in years. Then I saw the footprints. At first, I thought they were mine, but the more I looked, the more I realized they weren't. They were bigger, deeper, like someone heavier had walked the same path. And they weren't old. The edges were still crisp, not softened by wind or rain. Someone else had been here. I stood there for a long time, listening. The forest was quiet, too quiet. No birds, no insects, just this thick, heavy silence that made my skin crawl. I turned back. I walked faster than before, my heart pounding. Every few minutes, I stopped to listen, but I never heard anything. Still, that feeling didn't go away. That sense of being watched, of something just out of sight. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was low again, the sky painted in dull shades of orange and pink. I checked around my tent, looking for any signs that someone had been there, but everything seemed untouched. Still, I couldn't shake the unease. That night, I kept the fire burning bright. I sat by the flames, staring into the trees, listening to the night. Every so often, I thought I saw movement, just a shadow shifting between the trunks, gone too fast to be sure. My mind was playing tricks on me. It had to be. But then, sometime past midnight, I heard it. A branch snapped, not far, maybe 30, 40 feet from my tent. I froze, every muscle tensed. The fire crackled, sending sparks into the air, but I didn't move. Another snap, closer this time. I grabbed the hatchet I'd brought, holding it tight. My breath was shallow, controlled. I listened. Silence. Minutes passed. Then an hour. Nothing. I stayed up the rest of the night, waiting. By morning, I felt sick with exhaustion. My head ached. My body was sluggish. But I didn't want to stay another night. I started packing. Fast. Then I noticed the footprints. Not mine. Not from the day before. Fresh ones. Leading from the trees right up to my campfire. Then back into the woods. Someone had been standing there, watching me. I didn't stop to think. I threw everything into my truck, barely securing the gear before speeding down the dirt road, my tires kicking up dust. I didn't slow down, not until I was miles away, back on the highway, where the trees finally thinned and the sun felt warm again. I didn't look back. I haven't been camping since. I still think about it, though, about those footprints, about that feeling of being watched, and about the fact that, in all my time out there, I never heard anyone leave. I had been hunting all my life. My father taught me, just as his father had taught him. It wasn't just about the kill. It was about the land, the patience, the stillness of the woods. I was never one for city life, never needed crowds or noise. I preferred the sound of wind pushing through the trees, the snap of a twig under a buck's hoof, the distant cry of some unseen animal in the dark. That was the life I knew. That's why I found myself out in the deep woods of Montana, miles away from any town, in the fall of 2018. I had scouted the area before: thick forests, rolling hills, a quiet lake with a narrow stream feeding into it. The kind of place that felt untouched. A place where the modern world didn't reach. That was exactly what I wanted. I packed light but smart. My rifle, a .308 Winchester, reliable and familiar. A good hunting knife. Enough food to last a week, though I planned to catch my own meals when possible. A tent, a sleeping bag, and all the essentials. I parked my truck off an old logging road and hiked deep into the woods, far enough that no one would stumble upon my camp. The first day was simple: set up camp, scout the area, get a feel for the land. There were deer tracks near the stream, fresh ones. A few signs of black bears, but nothing to worry about. The woods were silent except for the usual sounds: birds, wind, the rustle of leaves. Felt right. That night, I built a small fire and cooked up some venison jerky I had brought with me. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. I listened to the sounds of the forest, felt the stillness settle in around me. There was nothing out here but me and the wild. The second day, I started tracking. I moved slow, careful, scanning the ground for fresh tracks. The deer were close, and I followed their trail deeper into the trees. I walked for hours, rifle in hand, senses sharp. Then, around midday, I spotted one. A big buck, standing near the edge of a clearing, head low, grazing. I raised my rifle, steadying my breath. Just as I was about to squeeze the trigger, the buck's head snapped up. It wasn't looking at me. It was looking past me into the woods. Its ears twitched, its muscles tensed. Then, without warning, it bolted. Gone in seconds. I stayed completely still, listening. I didn't hear anything at first, just the usual rustling of leaves. But there was something else, something faint. A sound I couldn't quite place. Like movement, but slower, more deliberate. I turned, scanning the trees. Nothing. But that feeling, the one every hunter knows, the feeling of being watched. It was there. I stayed for a while, trying to shake it off. Maybe it was just a bear moving through the woods, or some other animal. Still, I kept my rifle ready as I made my way back to camp. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard something, a rustling too close, a faint snap of a twig. I kept my knife close, my rifle even closer. But when morning came, everything was quiet again. I told myself I was being paranoid. The third day, I went deeper into the woods. I followed a fresh set of tracks, leading me to a small ridge overlooking the valley. The view was incredible, miles of untouched wilderness stretching into the horizon. But then, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A tent. It was old, weathered, a single-person setup, half collapsed. At first, I thought maybe it was from another hunter who had left it behind, but as I got closer, I saw the state of it. Torn fabric, a rusted zipper, scattered gear, half buried under leaves. It had been there a long time. Then I saw the knife. It was stabbed into a nearby tree, rusted, weathered like the tent. But the way it was stuck there, it wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. A message. I felt that same sensation again. That feeling of being watched. I didn't stay. I backed away, keeping my rifle raised, and made my way back toward camp. My pace quickened. The silence of the woods felt wrong now, too thick. Every instinct told me to leave, to get back to my truck and go. When I reached my camp, I stopped dead. My gear was scattered. My tent was slashed open. My backpack, which I had left zipped, was torn apart. My food gone. But the firewood I had stacked was untouched. My rifle, which I had taken with me, was the only thing I had left intact. Someone had been here, Someone was watching. I forced myself to stay calm. I gathered what was left of my things and packed up fast. I wasn't going to spend another night here. I started moving, heading straight for where I had left my truck. It would be a long hike, but I didn't care. I just needed to get out. As I moved through the trees, I kept looking back. I knew better than to let paranoia take over, but I couldn't shake the feeling. The woods were too quiet. Then I saw it. A figure, just for a second between the trees. Too far to make out any details, but close enough to know it was a person. Standing still, watching. I didn't hesitate. I moved faster, rifle in hand, heart pounding. The hike back felt endless. Every rustle, every snap of a branch sent my pulse racing. But I never saw the figure again. By the time I reached my truck, the sun was starting to set. I threw my gear into the back and got in, locking the doors. I sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, breathing hard. Then, just as I turned the key, I noticed something in my side mirror. A figure, standing at the tree line, not moving. I didn't wait. I started the truck, slammed it into reverse, and got out of there as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. I didn't look back. I never reported it. Never went back. I don't know who was out there. I don't want to know. But sometimes when I'm out hunting somewhere new, deep in the woods, and I get that feeling, that sense that I'm not alone, I remember that night, and I keep moving. I never liked camping in the rain, but sometimes plans don't go the way you want. I had set out for a 3-day trip in the woods, hoping for some peace and quiet away from the noise of life. It wasn't anything fancy, just a solo trip to clear my head. I wasn't new to the outdoors, and I had done my fair share of solo camping before. I had packed light but smart, bringing along a sturdy tent, plenty of food, a good sleeping bag, and the essentials to make sure I stayed dry and warm. The forecast had called for light showers, but by the time I made it to my spot, a small clearing near a shallow creek, it was obvious that the weather was going to be worse than expected. The sky had turned a dull, heavy gray, and the wind had started to pick up, pushing through the trees in restless bursts. Still, I wasn't too worried. I had camped through bad weather before. I found a good flat spot, cleared away some debris, and set up my tent before the rain got too heavy. The wind rattled the trees, and now and then, I could hear branches snapping somewhere off in the distance. It was eerie, sure, but nothing that set off any real alarm bells. By the time I had finished securing my tent, the rain had started coming down harder. The sound of it hitting the nylon fabric was steady, and the wind made the whole thing shake now and then, but I had staked it down well. I crawled inside, zipped it up, and settled in for the night. I wasn't tired yet, so I pulled out my flashlight and my old paperback. The sound of the rain outside was almost comforting. It drowned out the usual forest noises, the rustling of small animals, the occasional hoot of an owl, the snapping of twigs from unseen movements in the trees. I don't know how long I sat there, reading by flashlight, listening to the rain. An hour, maybe 2. The temperature had dropped, and I had wrapped my sleeping bag around me, leaning back against my backpack when I heard it. At first, I wasn't even sure I had actually heard something. Just a noise beneath the rain, faint and distant. It wasn't an animal sound. It wasn't the wind moving through the trees. It was something else, something moving. I turned off my flashlight and sat still, holding my breath. The rain kept coming down, steady and heavy, but I could still hear it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, not the hurried movement of a deer, not the light scurrying of a raccoon. It was someone. The sound stopped. For a long moment, I just sat there, barely breathing. My mind ran through all the possibilities. Maybe another camper, a hiker who got lost, But who would be wandering through the woods in the middle of a downpour, this late at night? I listened. The rain masked a lot of sounds, but I was sure now. There was someone out there, close by. The sound of footsteps had been distinct, cutting through the noise of the storm. I reached for my knife. It wasn't much, just a sturdy hunting knife I always brought along for emergencies. I felt the weight of it in my hand and tried to calm my breathing. Then, just when I thought maybe I had imagined it, I heard something new, a soft scraping sound. It was coming from the side of my tent. Something or someone was touching the fabric. I gripped my knife tighter and stayed completely still. The scraping stopped. A long silence followed, filled only with the sound of rain. Then, just as I started to think maybe I had imagined it, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were moving away. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. 20. I didn't move, didn't even shift my weight. The rain had soaked the ground outside, and I knew if I unzipped the tent and stepped out, I'd be making noise. I waited longer. Nothing. The wind picked up again, rattling the trees, but I didn't hear the footsteps anymore. I didn't hear anything except the rain. After what must have been an hour, I finally let myself breathe normally again. Maybe it had been an animal after all. Maybe my mind had played tricks on me. The rain, the darkness, it could mess with your senses. I lay back, gripping my knife, and eventually, exhaustion pulled me under. I woke up suddenly, my heart hammering. The rain had stopped. The silence was thick, pressing in on me. I strained my ears, listening, but the forest was still. Too still. The usual sounds of the night, bugs, distant owls, the rustling of leaves were gone. Then, from just outside my tent, I heard breathing. Deep, slow, measured. Not an animal. Someone was standing outside my tent. I didn't move. My mind was racing. My grip on my knife so tight my knuckles ached. The breathing stayed steady for a moment longer. Then the footsteps started again. Slow, heavy, moving around the tent, circling it. I stayed frozen. The footsteps stopped at the entrance. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Then the zipper moved, a single inch, then another. I didn't think. I lashed out with my knife, driving it toward the noise with all the force I had. A sharp grunt, the sound of something stumbling back. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my flashlight, unzipped the tent fully, and threw myself outside, ready to fight. Nothing. The forest was empty. The ground was wet. The trees swayed in the wind, but there was no one there. My breath came fast and hard. I shone my flashlight in shaking arcs around me, searching, but the woods were empty. Then I saw it. A single, deep footprint in the mud, and next to it a smear of blood. I wasn't alone. I grabbed my gear and ran. I didn't pack, didn't care about my tent or anything I left behind. I just ran, my flashlight bouncing in the darkness, my breath coming in sharp gasps. I didn't stop until I reached my car, miles away from my campsite. I locked the doors, started the engine, and sped away. I never went back for my gear. I don't know who was out there. I don't know what they wanted. But I know this: if I hadn't reacted when I did, if I had hesitated even a second longer, I wouldn't be here to tell this story. I don't know why I decided to go on that trip alone. Maybe I was trying to clear my head after everything that had happened. I had been camping for years, always with my wife, always with friends. But this time, I had no one. It had been a rough year, and I just wanted to get away from everything. I picked a remote spot in Montana, a place I had been once before with my wife years ago. Back then, it had been a peaceful trip, just the two of us in the middle of the wilderness, away from everything. Now it was just me, and the silence of the woods felt heavier than I remembered. I parked my truck at the trailhead, loaded up my pack, and started hiking in. The trail was rough, more overgrown than I remembered, but I chalked it up to the time of year. The summer had been dry, and the forest felt brittle, brown leaves, cracked branches. The undergrowth flattened like it had been trampled by something large. I ignored it. The plan was to hike about 10 miles in, set up camp near a small lake I remembered, and spend a few days just existing. No phone, no people, no distractions. Just me, the trees, and the sound of the wind moving through the branches. But things felt off from the start. I kept hearing something in the woods. Not constant, not loud, just something. Every now and then, a branch would snap somewhere off to my right. A rustling in the undergrowth that stopped the second I did. I tried to brush it off. Probably a deer, maybe a bear. I had my rifle with me and I wasn't worried. This was bear country after all. I kept moving. As the sun started dipping behind the mountains, I finally reached the lake. It was just as I remembered. Quiet, still, surrounded by thick pines on all sides. I set up my tent, built a fire, and cooked a simple meal. It should have been peaceful, but that feeling never left me. That sense of being watched. The woods were too quiet. No barges, no insects, no wind. Just the crackling of my fire and the occasional sound of water lapping against the shore. I forced myself to shake it off. I was being paranoid. It had been a long day, I was alone, and my mind was playing tricks on me. Then I heard it. A splash. Not a small one, not like a fish jumping. A heavy splash, like something big had stepped into the water. I froze, listening. My firelight only reached so far, and beyond that was just blackness. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the lake, but I didn't see anything. The water was still again. I told myself it was nothing. An animal, maybe, something moving in the shallows. But when I turned back toward my tent, something was different. The gear I had left outside, my water bottle, my cooking pot, my knife, wasn't where I had left it. The knife was gone completely. A cold feeling settled in my stomach. My mind raced for an explanation. Had I moved them without thinking? Had I forgotten where I placed them? I scanned the area with my flashlight. My breath felt too loud in the silence. My fingers itched toward my rifle. Then another sound, this time behind me. A footstep, not an animal, not a bear, a human footstep. I spun around, my light cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing there, just trees and shadows. I stayed up most of the night, sitting by the fire with my rifle across my lap, listening. The woods stayed silent. By the time the sun started creeping over the horizon, I had almost convinced myself that I was just jumpy, that I had imagined half of it. Maybe I had misplaced my knife. Maybe the sounds were just the forest settling. But I wasn't comfortable staying any longer. I packed up quickly, ready to head back to the truck. I had hiked in on a narrow trail, but as I started walking, something didn't feel right. The path looked different. I stopped, checked my map, looked around. I should have been heading west, back the way I came, but the sun was rising to my right. That meant I was going north. I turned back, retracing my steps. But after a few minutes, I realized I wasn't on the trail anymore. The trees looked different. The ground felt different. The undergrowth was thicker. I had only been walking for 15 minutes. There was no way I had gotten this lost. I tried to stay calm. I had a compass. I had supplies. I could backtrack. Then I saw something that stopped me cold. A footprint. Not mine. Someone else's. Deep in the dirt. Fresh. Barefoot. I looked around, scanning the trees, my heart pounding in my chest. Nothing. Just silence. I turned, moved faster, trying to find my way back. Every few minutes, I checked behind me, but I never saw anything. Then the smell hit me. Rot. Decay. like something had been left out in the sun too long. I gagged, covering my nose. The smell was strong, thick in the air. I followed it not because I wanted to, but because I needed to know what it was. Then I saw it, a deer, or what was left of it. The body was torn open, its insides spread across the ground. But it wasn't just a kill. It had been arranged. Its legs had been bent at strange angles, its head turned too far to the side. And on the ground beside it, my knife. I grabbed my rifle and ran. I didn't care where I was going. I just needed to get away. Branches scratched my arms, my legs. The forest blurred around me. My breath came in ragged gasps. I ran until my legs burned, until my vision blurred, until I couldn't run anymore. When I finally stopped, I had no idea where I was. The trees looked the same in every direction. I was lost, and then I heard it. A whistle. Not a bird, not the wind. A human whistle. Long, slow, deliberate. Came from behind me. I didn't turn around. I just started moving again, forcing my legs to keep going. I don't know how long I walked. Hours. The sun was high overhead by the time I finally saw something through the trees. A road. I stumbled out onto the pavement, nearly collapsing. Then I saw my truck. It was parked exactly where I had left it. I hadn't gone 10 miles. I had been walking in circles. I didn't stop to think about it. I didn't stop to breathe. I got in, started the engine, and drove. I didn't look in the rearview mirror. I didn't want to see if something was standing at the tree line. I drove until I hit the nearest town. I booked a motel, locked the door, and didn't sleep. The next morning, I checked my gear. My knife was back in my bag, but the blade was covered in blood. I never went back to that place. I don't know who was out there or what they wanted, but I know one thing for sure: I wasn't alone. It was late October when I went camping alone in the backwoods of Montana. I had always been comfortable in the wilderness. I grew up hunting with my father, spending days at a time out in the woods. I had learned how to track animals, how to recognize the sounds of the forest, and how to survive on my own. I wasn't afraid of being alone. That year, I had taken a week off work and driven out to a remote spot I had scouted the year before. It was about 15 miles off any real road, surrounded by thick pine and spruce trees. There was a river nearby where I could catch trout, and plenty of game trails where I could set up for hunting. It was perfect, isolated, quiet, and far from any distractions. I set up camp just before dark, clearing a small area for my tent and building a fire pit with rocks. The air was crisp, and the wind carried the scent of pine and damp earth. After cooking a simple meal over the fire, I sat back in my chair and listened to the sounds of the woods. The occasional rustling of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the soft crackling of my fire. Everything felt right. The first night passed without issue. I slept well, wrapped in my sleeping bag, waking only once when a gust of wind rattled the sides of my tent. The next day, I spent the morning fishing by the river, catching enough to cook for lunch. In the afternoon, I hiked out a few miles, scouting for good spots to hunt later in the week. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the trees, I started to get an odd feeling. It was subtle at first, just a strange sense that something wasn't right. The forest had gone quiet, too quiet. I had spent enough time outdoors to know the normal sounds of nature, and something was off. No birds, no insects, no distant rustling of small animals moving through the underbrush, just silence. I stood up from my chair and looked around. The trees stretched tall and dark, the shadows between them deepening as night settled in. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination. Maybe a predator had moved into the area, spooking the smaller animals. A bear or a cougar. I had my rifle, my knife, and my wits, There was nothing to be afraid of. Still, I kept my fire burning a little brighter that night. Sometime around midnight, I woke up suddenly. At first, I didn't know why. Then I heard it. A long, low sound coming from the trees. It wasn't a howl, not quite. More like a wail, stretched out and distorted. It sent a chill down my spine. I had never heard anything like it before. I sat up in my sleeping bag, heart pounding, straining to hear. The sound came again, closer this time. It was followed by a rustling noise, something moving through the brush just beyond my camp. I reached for my rifle, keeping still, listening. The movement stopped. The forest was silent again. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a coyote or a fox, something making strange noises in the night. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The next morning, I found tracks near my camp. Not animal tracks, human, barefoot. That was the first time I seriously considered leaving. The tracks were fresh, the imprints deep in the soft earth. They had circled my camp, stopping just a few feet from my tent before leading back into the woods. There was no reason for anyone to be out here. I had driven miles off the main road, hiked another few miles in. There were no cabins, no trails, no campsites nearby. No one should have been out here. I packed up most of my gear, deciding to move camp a few miles away. I had no interest in staying where someone had been watching me in the night. By late afternoon, I had set up again in a new spot, deeper into the forest. I made sure to choose a site with good visibility, setting up near a rocky outcrop where I could see in all directions. That night, the sounds returned. This time, they were closer. That same awful, wailing cry, coming from just beyond the tree line. Then the rustling again. Slow, deliberate movements, not the quick, darting sounds of an animal. I gripped my rifle and sat by the fire, staring into the darkness. I could feel eyes on me. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The forest fell silent again. I didn't sleep that night. I sat awake, listening, waiting. The feeling of being watched never left. When the sun finally rose, I made a decision. I was leaving. I packed quickly, not even stopping to eat. I slung my rifle over my shoulder and started the long hike back to my truck. But something followed me. I could hear it moving through the trees, always just out of sight. Twigs snapping, leaves crunching. Every time I stopped, it stopped. Every time I moved, it moved. My pace quickened. My heart pounded. Then, ahead of me, I saw something. At first, I thought it was a deer, a figure standing between the trees, just at the edge of my vision. But as I got closer, I realized it was wrong. It was tall, too tall. Its limbs were too long, its body too thin. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, watching me. Then it moved. Not like a person, not like an animal. It shifted, its form blurring for a moment. Then it was gone. I ran. I ran harder than I ever had in my life, crashing through the underbrush, my rifle gripped tight in my hands. I didn't stop. I didn't look back. I reached my truck and threw my gear inside, slamming the door shut, locking it. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. As I pulled onto the dirt road, I saw it again, standing just at the tree line, watching. Then it smiled. Not a normal smile. Too wide, too many teeth. A grin that stretched unnaturally across its face. I floored the gas pedal and didn't stop until I hit the highway. I don't know what I saw in those woods. I don't want to know. I haven't been back since. I had always loved camping. There was something about being out in the wild, away from the noise and the constant movement of the city, that made me feel alive. The air was crisp, the sounds of nature were soothing, and the simplicity of it all cleared my mind. But after what happened that weekend, I don't think I'll ever go camping again. It was late September, right before the air turned freezing, and I had taken a long weekend off work. I drove a few hours out of town to a spot I had been going to for years. It was deep in the woods, past the usual campgrounds where families parked their RVs and set up tents close to their cars. I wanted to be alone, so I went even further in, down an old dirt road, past the signs warning about limited cell service, until I reached a clearing I had found years ago. The clearing was perfect. A wide open space surrounded by tall pines, with a small stream nearby for water. It was completely silent except for the occasional rustling in the trees. I parked my truck at the edge of the clearing and started setting up camp. The sun was beginning to dip below the treetops by the time I had everything ready. I had pitched my tent, set up my small fire pit, and gathered enough wood to last me through the night. The evening air was cool, but I wasn't worried. I had my thick sleeping bag, my hunting knife strapped to my belt, and my rifle locked in the truck just in case. I had camped alone plenty of times before. There was nothing out here but animals, and I knew how to deal with those. I sat by the fire, cooking a simple meal on my little stove, letting the quiet sink in. I hadn't seen another person for hours, not since I left the main road. That's what I wanted. Just me, the trees, and the darkening sky. As I ate, I watched the fire flicker, listening to the way the flames cracked against the wood. The only other sounds were the crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, exactly what I needed. Then I heard it, a branch snapping. It was sharp, loud, close. Too close. I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth, listening. It wasn't the sound of an animal. Animals moved lightly, even the big ones. This was heavier, deliberate. Footsteps. I turned my head slowly, scanning the tree line behind me. The fire cast long shadows across the clearing, making it harder to see past the trunks. I reached for my flashlight and clicked it on, sweeping the beam toward the sound. Nothing. I waited, barely breathing. My ears strained against the quiet, but after a long moment, there was nothing but the usual nighttime sounds of the woods. Probably just a deer, I told myself. Maybe a raccoon looking for food. I was used to that. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I put my plate down and stood up, moving to the truck. I unlocked the door, slid out my rifle, and set it next to my chair by the fire, just in case. The rest of the night passed without anything strange happening. I stayed up for a while, listening, watching, but nothing else moved in the trees. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing and crawled into my tent. I slept lightly, waking up at every little noise. The wind through the trees, the shifting of branches. Every sound felt louder, closer. But by morning, the unease had faded, replaced by the normal calm I always felt when waking up in the wilderness. The sun filtered through the trees, warming the cool air. I made coffee on my little stove and sat by the fire, drinking it slowly, letting myself settle. I was being paranoid. It was probably just an animal. I spent most of the day hiking. I followed an old trail that led up to a ridge, where I could see miles of untouched forest stretching out in every direction. No roads, no buildings, no signs of people. It was perfect. By the time I got back to camp, the sun was dipping low again. I started another fire, cooked dinner, and let myself relax. Then I saw them. Footprints. Not mine. They were in the dirt near my truck, leading toward my tent. My stomach dropped. I stood frozen, staring at them, my mind racing. They were fresh. The edges were sharp, the dirt still loose where it had been pressed down. Someone had been here. I looked around, my heart pounding. The trees were thick, shadows stretching between them, but I couldn't see anyone. I listened, holding my breath. Nothing. I grabbed my rifle, keeping it close as I crouched down to examine the prints. They were big, a man's boot larger than mine, and there were more than just one set. 2, maybe 3 different sets of prints. I followed them carefully, moving around my camp. They circled the tent, led toward the edge of the clearing, then disappeared into the trees. Someone had been watching me while I was gone. A cold dread settled into my stomach. I had been out here alone for hours, thinking I was safe, but I wasn't. I backed toward the fire, my eyes scanning the treeline. If they had been here earlier, where were they now? I stayed up that night, rifle in my lap, watching the woods. I didn't go inside the tent. I kept the fire burning high, the flames casting flickering light into the trees. I didn't hear anything, but I felt it. I wasn't alone. At some point, exhaustion started to pull at me, my eyes drooping despite the fear. I forced myself to stay awake, gripping my rifle tighter. Then, just past the reach of the firelight, I saw it. A figure, standing between the trees. It didn't move, just stood there, barely visible in the dark. Watching me, my blood turned ice cold. I raised the rifle, aiming at the figure. My hands were steady, my finger on the trigger. I blinked. It was gone. I jumped to my feet, my heart hammering. I scanned the trees, searching for movement. Nothing. I wasn't imagining it. Someone was out there. I didn't sleep. I sat by the fire, gripping my rifle, waiting for morning. The moment the first light touched the trees, I packed up. I moved quickly, shoving my gear into the truck, keeping my back to nothing. I didn't care about breakfast, about the last bit of coffee still in my thermos. I just wanted to leave. As I climbed into the driver's seat, I took one last look around, and that's when I saw it. Carved into the tree, just behind where my tent had been, were words. Deep, jagged slashes in the bark. "You shouldn't be here." I slammed the door shut and started the truck, my hands shaking. Gravel spit out behind me as I tore out of the clearing, heading back down the dirt road. I didn't stop until I was miles away, back on the highway, back where I could see other cars, other people. I don't know who they were. I don't know what they wanted, but I never went back.